Heavenly Father, Divine Mother, friend, beloved God, great masters, Jesus Christ, Babaji Krishna, Lahiri Mahashai, Swami Sri Teshwar, and beloved Master, Paramhansa Yogananda Ji, saints of all religions, humbly we bow at thy feet. O Divine Mother, awaken us to thy loving presence within. Help us to share thy joy, thy wisdom with our families, with all those whom we meet. In thy name, Om Shanti Shanti. Amen.
A happy Father's Day yesterday. Was it yesterday? Or 2 days ago?
Something like that.
We have this tradition here in America, Father's Day. And Padma and I just visited our children in Portland and celebrated that along with a birthday or two. So it's good for us, perfect for us anyway, to talk about family life and discipleship. Not always an easy mix of things to bring together, but Padma has lots of wisdom on the subject.
Well, I think that's a punt over here. Many of you know I wrote a book recently called Hints of Laughter, Hints of Joy. And in the book, I share a few stories, but the joke between us is that when we started giving a lot more Sunday services, when Swami asked us to come to Seattle in 1993, at that point, our children were 11 and 13 years old. And Hriman would tease me sometimes after Sunday service because most of the stories I told had to do with our children, not sentimental stories, but life lesson stories, spiritual life lesson stories. And he said, what would you have done if we hadn't had children? I wouldn't have had much to say. Anyway, at the time that we raised our children at Ananda Village, they were in fact 11 and 13 when Swami asked us to move to Seattle. So before that, we were at Ananda Village. And at that point in time, there were 68 children in the Ananda school at the village. And all but one of those children were Ananda children. They all were parts of Ananda families. So there was a lot of opportunity at that point. Before that time, there were very few activities for the children at Ananda Village. There were mostly meditating adults there, and they weren't very adept at creating activities for the children. But by the time there were 68 of those little ones running around, a few people, adults who weren't necessarily even parents, but they were good with children and they loved children, created activities for them, which was a really important moment in the growth of Ananda because, we're all coming together as meditators and children can't sit still. So they are usually not included in a lot of our activities because they're in silence or they're meditative. And children can't hold that together. And it was very important for Ananda to grow up into this phase of learning how to engage children on their level. I mean, in a way that was interesting to them, that would make them also feel like they are part of the spiritual life. That was critical, so they don't feel like, well, this is something my parents do, and this is what we do over here, and it's very active and rajasic and very different. But they feel that we all valued, we need that childlike part of ourselves to express itself as well. When we were first asked to move to Seattle, Seattle in general is culturally, people tend to be very private. And we would joke that in the community apartment complex, all the curtains are drawn, because people have their little lives going on behind those curtains. And, they're not opening up wide so much. And so the people here tended to be renunciates and very quiet kind of people. So here come our preteen children, and they're dribbling their basketballs and they're, playing. And we would get phone calls sometimes, can you keep your children quiet? We're trying to take a nap or something. And we just felt like, well, this is really good for our community to have that childlike experience, quality, to learn how to be spiritual family of all ages, and not only a monastic kind of feeling, to be patient with one another, to learn to engage with the children and become childlike themselves, meaning not childish, as Swami would say, but childlike, meaning open-hearted, blessed. What was the saying? Suffer little children to come unto me, for such is the kingdom of God. So to be innocent like a child. And it's a very important balance in our communities, in our spiritual lives, to have those kinds of cross pollinations going on between different age groups and genders and everything, to learn how to mix with one another and be playful also. God is playful with us, so it behooves us not to be so serious all the time. So having said that, just a couple of little stories, and then I'll turn it over to Hriman. But when our children were little, we would take turns attending things. I know Naba and Michelle already do that. They take turns every other Sunday. One of them comes with Mala to service and Sunday school, while the other one stays home with Kieran. Well, we did the same with our children. And so I found myself not being present. Back then, Swami Kriyananda used to do a lot of the talks and classes and programs, Sunday services, and I would miss half of them. And then sometimes I would see him accidentally, because I didn't run into him a lot back then with little children, but I would see him and I'd say, I heard you gave a beautiful talk. And he'd say, get the tape. And I heard you gave a great class, get the tape. And then I realized I was supposed to get the tape. In other words, I did not have an excuse for missing half of the teachings that he was offering because I wasn't able to be physically present. I could get the tape of the class and I could listen to it later. And these days, of course, it's videos. And YouTube channel is filled with gazillions of Swami Kriyananda's talks. And so even if you come to Ananda today and he's not alive any longer, there really isn't an excuse not to be familiar with everything he shared and taught, because we can take the time late at night, whenever we have some time, to listen and watch and hear all those teachings, have them become part of our life experience, part of our consciousness. Yeah, and the other one that was really important for me, because, you either sit and meditate or you're really busy nursing or taking care of your child. And I would be exhausted, like Sambhavi was saying. She's a little tired for her. It's nighttime. I would feel exhausted. And one time I happened to bump into Swami and I told him, it's really difficult for me. I do it to do my Kriya, but I'm exhausted. And because I'm nursing all the time, day and night. And he said, practice Kriya while you're nursing. And that never occurred to me. I thought the two would be mutually exclusive. You couldn't do that. But what he was saying is, no matter what is happening in our lives, we can do that. Hriman likes to tell stories that, if he stopped at a stoplight, he'll do 2 or 3 Kriyas while he's waiting for the light to change. In other words, we can integrate our spiritual life with our other duties and life experiences, so that, I would have people say to me sometimes, when my children go off to college, then I'm going to start meditating. And I would be standing there with, a 5-year-old and a 7-year-old. And I was meditating. I would say, well, why? Why wait? Why not start now and do what you can, what we can, even if it's short, just to do it, to do something, not to break the flow, not to separate. This is my spiritual life and this is the rest of my life, or my duties and responsibilities. Integrate them, do both and as much as possible, and you'll find you can get creative with it. You'll find that there's always a way to have it be able to be so.
Well, my perspective is perhaps obviously a fatherly one, but what I have found helpful and what I see could be helpful to others, because I do counseling as well, is the fact that the child is born in our bodies, in the mother's body, obviously. And from the moment that child comes out of the body, the rest of the history of that relationship is step step-by-step distancing and detaching all the way to through school and college and beyond and out of the household. And, our teachings and Swamiji trying to counsel us as parents, young parents years ago, would remind us that little helpless infant or toddler or school-age child acting up, the toddler practicing tantrum yoga, is a soul, and an old soul at that. I used to sometimes say in talks I give that I don't know how any parent can refuse to believe in reincarnation, because as a parent, we see how much baggage, how many predispositions, how much personality each child brings to the table from the moment of birth. And so our goal is a little bit like that of the physicians: do no harm. In other words, we can do good things for our children and guide them and so on, of course, but they have karma of their own. And the sooner we recognize that we're there to guide and protect and discipline, for which is greatly lacking in today's world, but we're there to help them stand up on their own feet. Like Swamiji said, the best yoga posture is that which helps you stand on your own 2 feet. In other words, the sooner we get a clear perspective on what our job is, what our role is, spiritually as well as in human ways, the better the outcome's going to be. You all know that in this society, at least here in America, I don't know about Europe, we use the term helicopter parenting, which means in fact, I've heard parents say that the new model of parenting is attached parenting. Well, that's not true in yoga. It's about understanding the boundaries, even though in the larger picture we are one, but in the picture of our evolution towards oneness, we need to respect our boundaries, respect the right of children, especially as they get older, to express their willpower, okay, and yet provide boundaries to that. Our society, certainly here in the West, but I think in fact everywhere, is very confused about that, about what are the boundaries, what are the roles of parents. Former generations, like when I grew up, the typical fault was to expect your child, especially male children in former generations, to be a knockoff of the parent or the family or the father. We don't so much suffer from that delusion now, but our delusion is somewhat the opposite, which is the child knows best. Let the child express itself without giving clear and appropriate guidance at the different age levels. We have, for example, in issues of sleep and in hours of play and hours of rest, it varies quite a bit, I know, but our role is not to be, as hippies used to say in my generation, we're not here to be our child's best friend. That could come later, perhaps, when they're an adult, but we're here to help them grow and help them leave the house on their own 2 feet. And that can mean disciplining at times, and in a way that's I'll tell you a funny story, at least I think it's funny. One time our 2 children, we were all at home, and my son, who is the older of the 2, was acting out and doing something he shouldn't have. And I got a bit upset at him, and so I was perhaps yelling at him. I don't know if I was yelling, but anyway, I was scolding him. And over in the corner was our daughter, the younger one, and Mom, Padma. And little Gita, this is at Ananda Village, turns to her mother and says, "Mom, the reason Dad acts like that is because he wasn't born at Ananda." And then only one time I made the mistake, because this was how I was raised. in a former, I made the mistake of giving my son a paddle on the rear end. And he turned and he looked at me shocked, like, what are you doing? I don't need that. He was a very rational person and he just needed to be told what not to do, and that was enough. So
He said, just tell me what you want, Dad.
yeah, just tell me what you want. You don't need to give me a whack on the rear end. So there's many different styles, and some children need more, discipline. Others need just a word. So, and of course, you are who you are. So there's no pat formula. But knowing what our role is a good beginning. And our role is to help them grow and go out on their own as a mature adult who's been given respect and kindness, and yes, boundaries. Boundaries is synonymous with discipline. When I would counsel a father of a teenager who, at least in America, tends to be a rebellious time of life, it was for me too, I would say, remember, you're the parent and they are the child. Therefore, they're not going to, even when they're yelling at you and calling you bad names, which sometimes happens, you need to know where your boundaries are. For example, an obvious boundary would be any physical contact. I recall when my elder brother had a fight with my father. That was the generation that I was raised in. I mean, just, like this. Well, I don't think that happens anymore, but in other words, you as a parent, mother or father, you do need to establish certain boundaries when things get difficult in those teen years. But nonetheless, you are the parent. And so the teenager may be acting out and yelling and pushing all your buttons as they know beautifully how to do. Your job is to remain calm. And the boundary of not accepting behavior might mean that you turn and walk out of the room and don't accept that behavior, but that's a difficult thing to judge in advance. But your calmness, your ability to remain respect when they are not being respectful, is teaching them how adults, which they will soon become, behave with respect to one another. And so not losing it when they are misbehaving, or even the toddler who's practicing what I call tantrum yoga. It's so easy to go down to their level and yell and so on and so forth. At the same time, I remember Swami would give the example as if that little toddler runs out in the street, and I actually had that happen once, runs out in the street. You don't say, come back, Johnny, you might get her. You grab that kid by the scruff of the neck and yank him off the street. So, and Yogananda would sometimes, discipline a monastic with raising his voice, but he wasn't really angry. And so parents can sometimes have to be very strong in their words. But does that mean you're actually angry? That's not easy to do, I admit it. But what I'm saying is there's no template that one size fits all. And so the range of behaviors and relationships with the children will vary greatly. But as long as you know what your role is, then you have at least some inner guideline. And if you're a meditator, you'll be able to draw on the intuition to know where some of those boundaries exist. The other last thing I want to say is not something that I would use as a parent, but in more recent years, thinking of dealing with parents, because Padma and I went through the stage where our parents are gone and roles reverse and you begin caring for parents. And one of the things that applies to all facets of life, including parenting, as the parent, is that each person has their own karma. And rescuing a child from their karma is not helping them. what I see today in the school setting, something I never saw in my growing up, is that too often the parents side with the child and blame the teacher. That doesn't help the child at all. Even if the teacher were wrong, if you side with the child in front of the child and against the teacher, then you're teaching disloyalty, and you're teaching, it's not going to help the child. There are times when we just have to learn to obey, so to speak, and to respect authority and so forth. So rescuing another person, whether it be an elder parent or a toddler or a school-age child, from the karma that they've incurred as a result, let's say, of their behavior in the classroom. I remember Swami would sometimes use an accusation against one of us by another devotee as an opportunity to scold us, even though we knew that what we were accused of was wrong. And Master would do this too. So let's say your child is accused of something in the classroom. Of course, you're not there, so you don't really know if it's true, but maybe you suspect it's not true. Nonetheless, it can be not as if the teacher is scolding that child, it can be an opportunity to experience what it means to be criticized or scolded, you see. And so not rescuing your child from their karma, including sickness and illness and disease and critique and so on and so forth, is not an easy thing to do, okay? So I won't say more than that because it's always particular to everybody. What I want to stand for is the yogic value of non-attachment and giving people the boundaries to let their own karma unfold.
Maybe we should open it up to discussion.
Yeah, I think we should.
Would anyone like to comment or ask?
I'll open it up. Hi, I'm Hansa, and I'm in Switzerland right now. I'm making floral arrangements and listening at the same time. And I just want to say how deeply grateful I am for this shared wisdom. It gives me a lot of food for thought. Our daughter is almost 15, so we're out of those tantrum years, but I love tantrum yoga. That's wonderful. It's a wonderful way for parents to exactly laugh a little bit and distance themselves from that drama. And I also love how at the beginning you mentioned that a lot of people at Ananda who weren't parents really stepped up and helped to create activities for the children. We started this group with the name Parents Sangha, and just this week we've changed it to Family Sangha because we also have devotees and Kriyabans who have been participating in this group since the beginning, who don't have children of their own, but they feel very, very special calling in the lives of children. So yeah, I love that somehow we're carrying that forward. Thank you both so much.
That's when the community really grew up, when people felt to step up, whether they had children or not, to participate with families.
A spiritual work like Ananda, and really the spiritual life of any of us, gains credibility when it reaches out to help others. And in the context of parenting, what Padma just said was a major, and Swami said to us, I want the children of this community, I want the adults of this community to see these children as our children. Now, that didn't erase the boundary of what a parent is and what a parent's responsible for, but it was more an attitude of sense of belonging and caring and interest in the welfare and development and safety of those children.
Padma, uh, sorry, guys. Yeah. In your book, the story that I think inspired me to reach out to you both in the first place was the one about the pan that Swamiji bought you in Europe.
Yes.
So I wonder if you could share that story if others haven't read the book yet, and then talk about how you took that learning sort of in other areas of your life.
Yes. For me, it was a great lesson in japa, practicing the presence. We were in Lugano, Switzerland with Swamiji, and there was a large department store that had a really beautiful cafeteria on the top floor that he liked to eat at. And so we went in that department store, and along the way, there was a demonstration somebody was giving for these non-stick frying pans, big frying pans. And we watched the demonstration, and then he bought one and he gave it to me. And he said, you know, you're a mother, here you go, you can use this. And we're in Europe, right? Very limited luggage. So we had to, and we were only halfway through our trip. So we had to schlep this big pan around with us through Europe and also all the way home. And that's when I realized the wisdom of the gift he had given me, because I spent a lot of time in the kitchen. And every time I would pull out that pan, I would treasure it. I would think about him, which made me think about Master Yogananda, which made me think about God. And so I was bringing that divine memory into, you know, many hours of my day in the kitchen cooking. And so I realized that, well, I took that concept and I brought it into many other aspects of my life. For instance, I had the great blessing of working closely with Swamiji for many years. And he would often call me at home at all hours of the day and night. I always had a picture of Yogananda right by my phone, wherever I was. And later with the cell phone, I had it near me always, a picture, so that when Swamiji would call, I would look at Yogananda's eyes. And that would help me to stay open and be focused on what he's saying, because it was never just the words. It was always the vibration that went with those words, the intonation. There were just many subtle aspects of it. So helping to practice the presence of God is such an important part, especially of those of us with active lives as parents and families. In the midst of all that, to be able to stay in remembrance is essential. Oh, right. Our daughter, Gita, is a light bearer now at Ananda in Portland. But when she was about 19, she decided that she wanted to really learn to meditate in earnest. So she actually took some classes also from us, the Raja Yoga course and so on. And she worked her way towards Kriya. And at one point, she said to me, Mom, why didn't you teach me some of this when I was younger? I would have loved to have known it. And I said, because you never asked. And I meant that quite sincerely that for a child especially, if they don't ask and you share something with them before they're ready to absorb it, they could actually rebel against it. They could actually, do the opposite. And it's not just a child. Adults are the same way. We have to have that openness and that interest before we'll let it in. And she understood that. She understood what we meant. So, of course, it was all around her at Ananda Village, but it wasn't conscious yet with her until she was older. Hi, Gayatri.
Hello, thank you for sharing so beautifully. A parent wrote me that wasn't able to come today, but their question was, how do you navigate spiritually as a family when challenges come up around the house and relating to the family?
Well, that's a global question. I mean, that's a pretty broad question, depending on what it is. If the family as a whole is challenged, or if just one member of the family is challenged, like the child. I think mainly what Hriman was saying is we want to approach everything calmly. We want to be able to be as self-honest as possible. We want to try not to blame people or, it's your fault, that kind of thing. We want to try to be helpful in whatever our reactions are. I don't know if those are helpful. Can you think of other?
Well, Gayatri, in my mother's generation, which is going way back, family troubles were hidden and never discussed. My mother did not even know by what cause her mother died when my mother was a teenage girl. But what I'm seeing a lot of today, and maybe not a lot of, but what I tend to see is perhaps just the opposite. Too much sharing to children who are not ready to understand or accept what's going on. And so to me, we need to find, again, I'll use the word boundaries about, for example, the typical thing, because divorce is practically the rule these days, I'm sorry to say, but because of that, in the issue of how children accept what's going on when parents split, it's a very sensitive issue. We all know that children, for example, tend to blame themselves for what happened. That's just an example. I don't want to focus on divorce, of course. But what I'm saying is, to what extent does the family share? In Master's generation, he never heard his parents argue. Well, how many of us can say that? And even Swami said he never heard his parents argue. Well, again, I don't know how realistic that was in that generation. But, the bottom line that we need to strive for is calmness and respect. And when we're agitated, that's not the moment to try to, work out the issues particularly. The technique of children being sent to a corner to chill out or to their room or whatever applies to us too. When we're angry, when we're upset, we're bound to say something we're going to regret. So I do think it's a healthy habit when families get together calmly to discuss family issues. It can be chores, giving the children chores, which I very much endorse, and which is honored in the breach, I suspect, these days. But, I do think family councils are very good and bring things out in the open when they can be done in the right way. I don't know if that makes any sense or is helpful at all.
That's great. Thank you.
I was thinking of another example that Riemann talked about non-attachment. When our children were little, we started the tradition about a month before Christmas. I would go through their closets with them, and we would make a pile of all the things they were no longer playing with and clothes they were no longer wearing, but definitely toys they had outgrown. And we would bring them to a charitable organization, essentially to make room at Christmas time for their new gifts without them, becoming so piling out of their closets and not being used any longer, the old ones. So, and then also on Christmas morning, we would take the time to sit and offer prayers for the world around the Christmas tree before we started taking turns opening the gifts around the tree calmly rather than attacking and, tearing apart the gifts. There's nothing wrong in enthusiasm, but we were trying to help them be calm and even-minded in those circumstances and learn some non-attachment by getting rid of their old things they're not using and giving them to somebody who could use them. So I'm just giving you a couple of little examples of traditions that we started that could help them in those ways. And then one other little story is our daughter went to visit her grandparents at Easter time once. She was about 10, and her grandparents were devout Catholic, Rieman's parents. And they took her to Mass. And later her grandfather asked her, well, what did you think about the sermon? And Gita said, well, I thought it was fine. She said, except I didn't agree with him, the priest. And her grandfather said, well, what didn't you agree with? And she said, well, he talked about creating a sin that would doom you to hell for eternity. She said, I don't believe in that. I believe in a forgiving God, she said. And even though he was a devout Catholic, he was very impressed with her mature answer to that particular situation. So anyway, what I'm trying to say is they absorb. If you share with them the teachings on the level that they can relate to, it goes into their DNA too, and they form their own conclusions.
I'll give you one quick last story. When I was a child, we had 5 children in our family, 2 parents of 7. And the only time I saw my mother bake pies or do stuff was when they walked out the front door to a bake sale for our church. And as a child, I said, oh, darn, I don't get any of this. But it taught me the importance of parents modeling selfless service to other families or to other worthwhile causes. Because even if the children don't really understand what's going on, and in my case, even didn't like it, it was a lifelong lesson for me. And so going beyond the us for no more, as Master called it, and serving other causes, involving the children in that, is a lesson that will be a lifesaver for them for opening their hearts, their minds, and even their wallets someday for helping others.
Thank you so much, Padma and Hriman, for sharing today.
Our joy.
Nice to meet you, Shambhavi. Maybe someday we'll get to meet in person.
And Hansa.
Yeah, and Hansa.
The rest of you we know and love.
Okay. God bless you all.
Thank you so much.